Old Hollis has kept the store in Cedar Hollow long enough to know there's no lonelier sound in the world than a train pulling out and leaving someone standing on the platform who thought they'd been sent for. He'll tell you, he heard that exact sound the spring Clara Whitfield came west, heard the whistle fade and turned, and saw a woman standing alone by the rails with one carpet bag and a face trying very hard not to break. Pull up a chair. There's coffee on, and a plate kept warm by the lamp if you've a mind for it. Her name was Clara Whitfield, and she was 26 the day Cedar Hollow watched her be sent back like a parcel that hadn't pleased. She had come a long way on the strength of a letter. A man named Harlan Vance, who owned the new feedlot and half the talk in town and thought a great deal of himself, had advertised back east for a wife, and Clara had answered honestly. She wrote that she was no beauty but a hard worker, that she could keep a house and cook for a crowd, and wasn't afraid of work. He had written back fine words and a train ticket. So she sold what little she had and rode the cars 4 days west to marry a man she'd never met, carrying her dead mother's receipt book wrapped in a shawl like the treasure it was. But in the weeks she'd been traveling, Harlan Vance had set his cap at the banker's daughter, younger, prettier, with a dowry attached. And a man like Harlan would sooner humiliate a woman in public than admit in private that he'd changed his mind and wasted her journey. So when Clara stepped down onto the platform and asked, hopeful and travel-worn, for Mr. Vance, he came. He came with 2 of his friends, and he looked her up and down in front of the whole gathered platform, and he laughed. Said he'd expected better for his money. Said she was older and plainer than her letter led on, and he'd not be held to any bargain made sight unseen. Said it loud, so the loafers by the depot could enjoy it. And then he tipped his hat mockingly and walked off and left her standing there with the steam settling and her face on fire. The town women on the platform bench did not help her. Mrs. Pruitt observed that a woman who'd travel across the country for a stranger oughtn't be surprised. Mrs. Gantry said it was a shame, in the tone of one enjoying it. The Vance sisters, who were cousins to Harlan and proud of it, tittered behind their gloves. Clara Whitfield stood very straight and did not weep where they could see, and she did not give them the collapse they were waiting for. But she had nowhere on this earth to go, and 70 cents, and a bag. At the end of the platform, old Hollis had come down to collect a crate of nails off the freight car. He took one look at the whole sorry business and did the thing nobody else in Cedar Hollow had thought to do. He took off his hat to her. "Ma'am," he said, "you look about wore through. The boarding house is full up, but Reed's roadhouse takes lodgers, and Jonah Reed's a decent man, which is more than I can say for some who breathe the air around here." He picked up her carpet bag before she could argue. "And have you eaten? Don't tell me you have, for I can see you haven't. Come on. A body can't think straight on an empty stomach. That's just sense." That was the first kindness Cedar Hollow showed Clara Whitfield, and she did not forget it. Now, Reed's roadhouse sat at the edge of town where the stage road came in, a long, low building with a dining hall that had once been the pride of the county. Travelers used to plan their journeys to stop there at supper time. But that was when Ruth Reed was alive and standing at the cook stove. Ruth had died of a fever 2 winters back, and since then her husband Jonah had tried to keep the place running with a string of cooks who came and went, and the food had gone from famous to forgettable to plain bad. The travelers stopped grumbling and started passing on through to the next town. The dining hall sat empty most nights, and Jonah Reed, who was 34 and quiet and weather-worn, with his late wife's eyes looking back at him every morning out of their boy's face, watched the thing Ruth had built come apart in his hands and did not know how to stop it. He had a son, Sam, who was 8 years old and too thin. The boy had stopped eating proper when his mama died, picked at his food, pushed it around, said he wasn't hungry. A man can fix a roof and mend a harness, but he cannot make a grieving child eat. And it was wearing Jonah down to the bone. It was into this that old Hollis walked Clara Whitfield, carpet bag and all. She took the cheapest room they had, up under the eaves, and meant to find honest work and move on the moment she could afford a ticket to somewhere that hadn't watched her be laughed at. But that first evening she came down to the empty dining hall, and she saw the cold cook stove, and she saw Jonah Reed standing at it, holding a scorched pan of something that had been meant for his boy's supper and had not turned out, and she saw the thin child at the long table not eating it. And Clara Whitfield, who had been raised that you do not stand idle in a kitchen that needs help, rolled up her sleeves. "Sit down, Mr. Reed," she said. "Let me. If you've ever had nothing in the world but the one thing your hands know how to do, stay with me a while. This is a story about a woman who was finally seen for what she could give, and I'd be glad to know what town you're listening from tonight." She found flour and buttermilk gone just sharp enough, and a little bacon grease. And within the half hour, the cold, dead kitchen smelled like something alive. She set a plate of hot biscuits and white gravy in front of the boy, without a word of fuss, the way you'd set down anything ordinary, and she did not stand over him watching. And little Sam Reed, who had not eaten a proper supper in the memory of anyone at that table, ate 3 biscuits and asked, shy, if there were more. There were more. There is always more at a table where a body is welcome. Jonah Reed stood in the doorway and watched his thin, grieving son eat like a healthy child for the first time since the fever took his mother, and he had to turn his hat round and round in his hands to keep his composure. "Ma'am," he said when he could, "can you cook?" It was a foolish thing to ask a woman whose biscuits he'd just watched bring his boy back to the table, and they both nearly smiled at the foolishness of it. "I can," Clara said. "Plain or fine, for 2 or for 50. Bread, pies, a roast that'll make a grown man homesick. I cooked for a logging camp of 40 men for 3 years, and never had a complaint that mattered. It's the one thing I've always been able to do, Mr. Reed, no matter what anybody thought of my face." She lifted her chin a little. "But I'll not be kept on out of pity, and I'll not be kept on to be talked about in this town. I've got a dining hall that used to feed the whole stage road and now can't feed my own boy," Jonah said. "That's not pity. That's the best job in Cedar Hollow going to waste for want of someone who can do it." He glanced toward the window, toward town, and his jaw set pleasant and firm. "As for the talk, I buried the only opinion I cared about 2 winters ago. I don't much mind the rest. There'd be wages and your room, and your Sundays to yourself." So she took the work. What else does a woman with 70 cents in a carpet bag do when an honest kitchen opens its door? The lamp was lit in the roadhouse window that night when Clara finally climbed the stairs to her room under the eaves, and she stood a moment at the little gable window, looking down at it. That warm square of light spilling out onto the stage road. The way a lamp says someone is still up. Someone is still keeping the place. She had not felt the warmth of a lit window meant partly for her in longer than she cared to count. She set her mother's receipt book on the washstand where she could see it, and she slept. She made herself useful the way bread makes itself useful, by feeding whoever came. In a week, the word had got down the stage road that Reed's was worth stopping at again. In 2 weeks, the dining hall had folks in it of an evening, drummers and freighters and a circuit preacher, all of them mopping gravy with Clara Whitfield's biscuits and asking when the pie came. She scrubbed the long, neglected kitchen down to the grain of the wood. She put up preserves. She learned that Sam liked his eggs a particular way, and made them that way without being asked, and the boy began to fill out and to follow her about the kitchen and by to laugh. The hands and the regulars noticed. A roadhouse where the stove is warm and the bread is rising, and there's a woman humming low over a pot of an evening is a different place than one slowly going dark. Old Hollis took to driving out for his supper twice a week, and said to anyone who'd listen that Reed's was the only place in the county where a man could get a meal that loved him back. And one rainy afternoon, going through the kitchen dresser for a missing pie tin, Clara found Ruth Reed's receipt book, the dead woman's own, in a careful hand, splattered and dog-eared and loved, with little notes in the margins. Sam's first tooth made him the soft custard. Jonah favors the dried apple. She held it a long while. Then she carried it to Jonah, plain, and asked if she might cook from it, or if he'd sooner she put it back and not stir what was painful. Jonah Reed stood with his hat in his hands and could not speak for a moment. Ruth would want her receipts used, he said at last, rough. It always troubled her, the thought of all that going to waste in a drawer. So Clara cooked from Ruth Reed's book, and the first thing she made from it was the dried apple pie with the note beside it, and she set a slice in front of Sam, and the boy took one bite and went very still and said, "Small, that's my mama's pie." And then he cried, the good kind that had been stuck in him 2 years, and Clara held him while he did. And over his head she and Jonah looked at each other a long, quiet moment that neither of them had words for yet. The town did not soften all at once. Harlan Vance, who had laughed at her on the platform, did not care to see the woman he'd discarded become the talk of the county for a good reason, instead of a cruel one. One evening after the dining hall had emptied and Sam was asleep, Jonah lingered at the long table the way a man does when he has something to say, and no practice at saying it. Clara wiped down the stove and did not press him. The lamp was low and the stage road outside was quiet. "They tell a story about you in town," he said at last, careful, like a man stepping onto creek ice. "About the platform and Vance. I never asked you your side of it. Figured a person's owed the asking before the believing." So she told him, not for pity, for she had none left to spend on herself, but plain the way you'd report the weather. The letter she'd answered honest. The ticket. 4 days on the cars with her mother's receipt book wrapped in a shawl, believing she was going to be somebody's wife, and then a man looking her over like livestock in front of a laughing crowd, and deciding out loud she wasn't worth the bargain. She told it dry-eyed and waited for the small flinch of doubt she'd learned to expect from every face in the county. It did not come. Jonah Reed looked at her a long moment, and then he said, "Lo, a man who'd shame a woman in public to save himself a hard word in private is a man too small to have deserved the trip she made." He turned his hat once in his hands, not to leave, only to have somewhere to put the feeling. Ruth used to say you could tell everything about a person by whether they were kind when it cost them nothing. You've been kind to my boy when this town gave you every reason to keep your kindness to yourself. He stood, awkward. I just wanted you to know I never believed a word of it. That's all. It is a strange and powerful thing to be believed. Clara had near forgotten how it felt, and she carried the warmth of that small plain speech a long way up the stairs that night. And so, by the look of him at breakfast, did he. So he talked. Said Jonah Reed had taken a rejected mail-order bride under his roof with an innocent boy in the house. Said it in the saloon and on the church steps until some who'd half forgotten took it up again. Mrs. Pruitt allowed it was a shame about the boy. But Clara had stopped waiting on Cedar Hollow's pardon. She'd found something better than a pardon out at the end of the stage road. A stove that was hers to tend. A child who reached for her hand. and a quiet man who turned his hat in his hands when she came into a room. Then came the week that changed everything, and it turned, as these things do, on the one thing nobody thought to count on. The stage line sent word that Mr. Forsyth, the division superintendent, was coming through to decide a matter of business, whether the Cedar Hollow stop was worth keeping on the line at all, or whether the stages should run straight through to the bigger town beyond. The whole of Cedar Hollow depended on that stage stop more than it liked to admit. The mail came by it, and the drummers who filled the store's till, and the travelers who kept the town on the map. And the superintendent, by long custom, judged a stop by its roadhouse, by its supper. Harlan Vance saw his chance. He'd built a fine new establishment of his own in town and wanted that stage contract for it. And he set about whispering to anyone who'd carry it that Reed's was a sad place run by a grieving widower and a woman of low reputation, and that the line would do better to favor a respectable house, meaning his. Mr. Forsyth arrived on the evening stage, tired and dusty and not inclined to be charmed, and he made it plain he'd take his supper at Reed's that night and his decision in the morning, and that the one would inform the other. The whole town found a reason to be near the roadhouse that evening. Clara Whitfield tied on her apron and did not let her hands shake. She had Ruth Reed's book and her own mother's beside it, and she had a cold larder and a few hours, and she cooked as though her whole life were riding on it, which, when you came down to it, it was, and not only hers. She roasted a haunch with herbs from the kitchen garden Ruth had planted and she'd revived. She baked bread that perfumed the whole dining hall. She made the dried apple pie from the dead woman's receipt and a custard besides, and biscuits that came apart in soft white leaves. She sent it all out hot and unhurried, course on course, the way a body cooks when feeding someone is the only love language she was ever sure of. Mr. Forsyth, the division superintendent, ate in silence for a long time. Then he set down his fork and asked to see the cook. Clara came out of the kitchen, flushed from the stove, wiping her hands on her apron, expecting heaven knew what. And before the half-full dining hall, before old Hollis and the freighters and two of the town women who'd come to watch and stayed to eat, Mr. Forsyth stood up and said that he had taken his supper in roadhouses from St. Louis to the coast, and that he had not had a finer meal anywhere on the line, and that as long as this kitchen served the Cedar Hollow stop, the stages would most certainly continue to stop in Cedar Hollow. He'd see to the contract himself in the morning. The dining hall was quiet a beat, and then somebody started clapping. And then they all did. Cooking, the one thing they'd sneered at, the woman they'd watched be laughed off the platform, had just saved the whole town's place on the map. Jonah Reed stood against the wall with his hat in his hands, and never once took his eyes off her. Harlan Vance left the roadhouse that night with his face dark, and his scheme came apart entirely the next morning when the contract was signed and witnessed at Reed's. And the truth of how he'd treated Clara, set beside how she'd carried herself since, did him no favors at all in a town that had just had the best supper of its collective life in the house he'd tried to ruin. He found Cedar Hollow a good deal less admiring of him after that, which is the gentlest justice there is, the kind a person never has to lift a finger for. But by then, Clara had stopped thinking about Harlan Vance at all. It was Sam who said the true thing, the way children do. They were at the long table after the dining hall had emptied, the lamp lit in the window, the smell of cinnamon still in the air, and the boy looked up from the last of his pie and asked Clara, plain, "Are you going to stay and be my ma?" The kitchen went very still. Clara looked at the boy, and then she made herself look at Jonah, because she would not let herself hope for a thing that hadn't been offered. Jonah Reed set down his coffee. He stood, and he picked his hat up off the peg out of pure habit, and he turned it round and round in his hands. "I've been 3 weeks trying to find the words," he said. and an 8-year-old's gone and found them first. He came around the table. I didn't take you on for pity, Clara, and I'm not asking now for pity. You brought my boy back to the table. You brought this whole place back to life. You cooked Ruth's receipts so kind, I could hardly stand in the room. I'd be honored if you'd stay, not for wages, for good, as my wife, with my name, and this for your home as long as you want it. He swallowed hard. There's a place set for you here. There always will be. Clara Whitfield, who had stood straight on a railway platform while a whole town laughed and had not let them see her break, found she could not stand straight against this. She bowed her head, but it was only to hide that she was weeping at last, and they were the good kind. Yes, she said. Lord, yes. Sam whooped and knocked his fork to the floor, and nobody minded one bit. They married in the early summer in the little church on the rise. Old Hollis gave the bride away and claimed loudly that it was the dust making his eyes water. Ruth Reed's receipt book stayed in the roadhouse kitchen where it belonged, used and flowered and loved, and Clara never once thought of it as anything but a gift from one woman who'd fed this family to the next. The carpet bag went up flat into the loft because a woman who has found her home does not need a bag packed by the door. And Reed's roadhouse, that had been quietly going dark for 2 long winters, was the brightest lit window on the whole stage road again. Not because a woman cooked, though she did, better than the county had any right to, because the heart had come back into the place, because there was a lamp in the window every dusk and a table laid, and a boy who slept easy and ate his fill, and the smell of bread rising before dawn. Old Hollis says he still takes his supper out at Reed's twice a week, and that he times his drive home for the dusk on purpose, just to see it from the road. The lit window at the edge of town, warm and gold against the blue evening. The way a lamp says someone's home, and someone's expected, and their supper kept warm against your coming. That's the whole of it. A woman the town laughed off the platform, seen clear by a quiet man, and given back her name, and a home, and a place at the table. If a story like that warmed you tonight, stay with me. Old Hollis has kept a good many of them, and there's always another by the fire. Sleep easy now. Wherever you are, there's a light on for you here.